We're pleased to welcome Melanie Benjamin in support of the Children's Blizzard in conversation with Paula McLain this evening. First, a quick overview of webinars. If you're joining us late, the chat is closed, but you might want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati Bookstore. And as I mentioned, we do have signed book plates while supplies last. So if you order to have the book shipped from the store to you anywhere in the country, or picked up curbside, if you live in Southeast Michigan, we can insert a book plate into the book for you. There is a link to purchase books in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. And you can submit questions for the Q&A following Melanie and Paula's conversation at any time. And I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. So whenever the spirit moves you, please feel free to submit those questions and I'll read some at the end. As a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make a donation at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening, this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and moderator this evening. Melanie Benjamin is a New York Times bestselling author of The Mistress of the Ritz, The Girls in the Picture, The Swans of Fifth Avenue, The Aviator's Wife, the autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb, and Alice, I Have Been. And Paula McLain is a New York Times bestselling author of the novels Love and Ruin, Circling the Sun, The Paris Wife, and A Ticket to Ride, the memoir Like Family, Growing Up in Other People's Houses, and 2 collections of poetry. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Good Housekeeping, the Oprah Magazine, Town and Country, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, and elsewhere. And her new novel, When the Stars Go Dark, is available for pre-order as well from Literati Bookstore. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So at home, please join me in welcoming Paula McLain and Melanie Benjamin into your living rooms.
Thank you so much. Thanks, John. Hi, Paula.
Hi, Melanie.
How are you?
Pleasure. We have met only once, but I feel like we've known each other for a long time. Obviously, I have followed your work for many years, and we also share an editor.
We do.
Absolutely brilliant, incandescent Susanna Porter. So I just have to give a shout out to her tonight and to congratulate you on this beautiful book, which is just out this week. So yeah, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about the book for those who haven't made their way to it yet.
Great, thanks. But before I do, I just want to remind you, I don't know if you remember, but a blizzard kept us apart at one point. Do you remember why we never met?
That's
and it was a blizzard.
Right. It was like a pre-publication dinner.
For you,
and they were calling it, weren't they calling it something like Snowpocalypse?
Snowpocalypse. So it was right before Paris Wife came out, and it was right before my novel, The Autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb, came out. And there was going to be a bookseller lunch in Chicago, and they started predicting this massive blizzard rolling in. And I remember talking to all our people at Random House. They were relying on me to be the weather person. And I think it is going to be really bad. So they ended up canceling. And they called it the Valentine's Day blizzard. It must have been 2012. Does that seem right?
No, I guess it would have been 2011.
2011. Yeah, right. And so we never met because of this, and it was a huge blizzard. It really was. So
no, I remember that too. Susanna calls me intrepid because once I had an event in New York and all the flights were canceled, and I got in my car and I drove.
Wow,
I thought that was shocking. But anyway, I like to think that we're both kind of intrepid and not afraid of a little bit of snow.
No, but not like this snow. So the children's blizzard. On the afternoon of January 12th, 1888, and it was a day that had dawned surprisingly warm, a devastating blizzard hit the Great Plains. And this blizzard is known as the Children's Blizzard. It hit right when school was letting out. So many of its victims, sadly, were children, both the pupils in the schoolhouses and their teachers, who were if young girls of 16 and 17, barely out of the classroom themselves, who had to make life and death decisions in an instant. Should they send the children home and hope that they would outrun the storm, or should they keep them inside and risk freezing to death in these really, paper thin prairie schoolhouses that were not meant to shelter people in a storm? So the novel is centered around this storm. It became a novel as I was researching it. It is a novel about immigrants. There is an immigrant story to it because so many of those settling the Great Plains in the 1800s, late 1800s, were immigrants from Northern Europe. It became a story certainly of segregation and the tragedy of the Native Americans whose land it had been. It became a story of disinformation, being sold as news, because many of the news stories that were planted in the newspapers of Norway and Sweden and Germany to try to get immigrants over here to homestead this land were absolutely fake. They were lies masked as news, describing this very harsh environment as everything but. So the Children's Blizzard follows a very diverse set of characters through the storm and the impact on their lives, but it mainly focuses on two sisters, both school teachers in separate districts, who make very different decisions when the storm hits in that really terrifying moment that they had to think, and how the impact of those decisions changed the trajectory of their lives and the lives of the school children in their charge.
Okay. Well, I think it's fascinating, and I had never heard of the Children's Blizzard before. And I was really surprised to see this title coming from you. So we're both known or have been known for years as being historical novelists who generally focus on real people from history, and most notably real women in history, extraordinary women from history whose lives perhaps have been unsung. And this time you've taken a real historical event, but then invented the characters. And I guess I just wondered why you made that decision and how this story came to you to begin with. Is the Children's Blizzard something you've always been familiar with, or did you discover it and then launch into the book that way?
Yeah, let's talk about this, because you too have taken a different direction in your next novel, which I'm going to plug right now, which is this When the Stars Go Dark.
Thank you.
Yeah, When the Stars Go Dark, which is different. So, later maybe you can talk about that too. It comes out in 3 months.
Yeah.
So it is different in that I am fictionalizing characters around an actual event. And I don't know about you. So I've written 6 historical novels prior to this one, and they were all about real people who lived. And I was very inspired by telling those stories of these real people's lives that I felt, mainly women, that had been overlooked or perhaps told by the men in their lives. So I looked at it as kind of bringing these women to light, giving them voice again. But I think I was done with that. And I'm never going to say never. Maybe I'll revisit it again. But for sure, I was looking, I don't ever want to write the same book twice. And I was really looking for a new direction. It got a little crowded, this genre that I think you and I were one of the original ones to do. And so I was having a hard time finding stories that had not yet already been told in this kind of genre as well. I don't know if you ran into that. So I just thought maybe it's time to challenge myself, to challenge my readers, and go in a little bit different direction. I also did want a bigger canvas. I think I was ready. My brain was ready to write a big sweeping kind of a saga of a story, and not just focusing on just not a little life, but a life, but many lives set on a very big canvas, this great sweeping time period of the homesteading years in the Great Plains, and then a big, very dramatic, actual, real life natural disaster. And I just thought it all sounded like a gripping story. I had known of the Children's Blizzard just by name and the basics of it. But it was a conversation I was having with my editor at the time about what next. And she had mentioned something, maybe it might be interesting for me to explore something with children in it. And that I just blurted out, the Children's Blizzard, and she'd never heard of it. And so I told her the basics and went off to do a little bit of research before I committed to it. And that's when I really realized it satisfied that need in me to be a little bit bigger, more dramatic. There's a thriller aspect to this. Absolutely. The storm, will they survive? It's a survival against the elements. And it also spoke to me because my own relatives on my mother's side came to this country in the 1870s. So around the time many of those in this story did, from Germany. And they settled in Illinois, not the upper Midwest, but still, these are my people. And in fact, I've named some of the characters in the novel after my grandparents, my great uncle. And that was very satisfactory for me to I knew these people, it helped me, I hope, write this story. So that's all why I decided to go in this slightly different direction historically. But before, I know we're here to talk about the Children's Blizzard, but I'm really curious to hear why you decided to go in a different direction too.
Well, thanks for asking. And I guess I'm nodding. I never felt that the genre was getting too crowded, but I did feel I wanted to challenge myself.
Yeah.
I was really ready. There's a part of me that is always kind of wanting to learn and grow and transform myself, my work, and to keep stretching into directions, because if you can't surprise yourself, right, then you'll never surprise the reader. And that I don't know, I did feel it when I was reading this book, that bigger canvas gave you room to stretch and grow. But I also felt like it was very sure-footed, like you were in territory that you understood. So maybe it's that, like, these are your people. And you're from the Midwest, correct?
Originally from Indianapolis.
Yeah.
And then lived in Chicago for 25 years, and now we're in Williamsburg, Virginia. Yeah, wasn't easy. No book is easy to write. I never want to say a book is easy to write. I've had books that have driven me to tears repeatedly. One of the biggest success I've ever had, The Aviator's Wife, was probably the hardest book I've ever written. I basically I wrote that book twice until we got the version that people have read. But I've had a couple of instances. The Swans of Fifth Avenue was one of them, and this was the other, where it was like, the writing was almost like a gift from the gods, that the story, and I do believe, I took enough time before I sat down to write to truly live with these characters and understand their stories and imagine their backstories and their families. And before I sat down to write, and I think for me, that's really vital, that I live with them a while before I do. But once I sat down, and this is a book where I'm juggling multiple points of view, unlike some of my other novels where it was kind of you're either following one or two people. So we're talking 6 characters, I think, that we follow through this, and animals as well. I got a little brave and daring, and had a couple of chapters from the point of view of animals who were caught in the storm. But it came to me so easily. The story spoke to me and sang to me. So it pretty much Susanna brilliantly helped me, guide me, once I turned it in. But I have to say, this was one of the more pleasant editing experiences I've had, because not a lot did change. Certainly she made it better, and she always does. But I have to say, this was not a book that made me weep.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy to hear it. One of the things that I guess I was most impressed by was how you handle just the storm itself. Like the snow starts to fall like immediately in this book. And then of course it's this driving force in the book. It's a character. It has this visceral impact on the characters. And of course you have to find fresh ways to describe it.
Yeah.
And continue to up the ante. So I follow you on Instagram, and I'm not sure exactly when it was, but you posted from some western locale where some huge blizzard was falling, and it seemed like you were there to write. And so talk about that a little bit. Did you deliberately go submerge yourself into a landscape?
No. So certainly, yeah, the challenge of, because the blizzard takes up the entire first half of the novel. And it starts almost at the very beginning. You're in the blizzard and you're experiencing it from several different characters' points of view, who are all experiencing it at a different kind of time and in a different location, and their journey is different. So, I had to look at it from a lot of different points of view. And there was a collection of oral histories of the survivors and the witnesses of the storm that was published back in the 1930s called In All Its Fury. And the eyewitness descriptions of the particular nature of the storm, because it truly was something no one had ever seen before. It wasn't your typical prairie blizzard. They all described the electric shocks that emanated from stoves and the rolling wheels of lightning that were, preceded this enormous cloud bearing down on them, and how the consistency of the snow even was unusual. It was a gritty sand-like snow that clogged people's nostrils and eyes, which didn't help in surviving the storm. So I had that to go from. And then certainly the challenge is to never repeat a phrase. So you have to come up with 1,000 different ways to describe snow and wind and cold and how it affects the flesh and the mind and the breathing and the vision and everything. So I loved it. I had a lot of fun with it, which seems an odd thing to say about a book that has its tragic aspects. Right. But I had great fun writing this because of that. It was like the perfect writing exercise to come up with all these different things. But then to your point, so when I'm near the end of many of my books, I haven't been able to do it with every book, but very frequently, when I'm nearing the end of a deadline, where I'm coming up on a deadline, I go out to Estes Park, Colorado, to a condo there that I've been staying at. And I usually, and for whatever, because my books tend to come out in January, so usually my deadline is a year before that. So it's usually the October-ish that I'm going up to the mountains to finish up writing. And I've been going there for many years. I went the week before Halloween this year. I have never seen it snow there. Estes Park is the Front Range. It's not like Vail. They don't get the snow at the same time of the year. Usually their snows come in the spring. While I was there, back to back, 2 blizzards hit, where I was trapped in my condo. I had enough to eat and I had firewood and it was fine, but I was literally trapped by these 2 enormous snowstorms that hit, and it was perfect. I delighted in the fact that I'd never had that happen before when I've been up there to finish a novel. Only for the children's blizzard did Colorado give me 2 blizzards, and
so you sequester yourself.
At the end of the book, yeah. Now, I mean, I get the bulk of the writing done just living my normal life here, right? You glue your butt in the chair and work that day, and you juggle it with all the other duties that you have as a published author, and writing other things for publication, doing speaking engagements. But yeah, I have found it extremely inspirational and productive. I can write, and I am not kidding, and you're going to hate me, but I can write 30,000. I can write 30,000 words in a week up there. There's something about being away from my normal.
I wouldn't
routine.
pass that around too much as a number.
I mean, I'm writing 6,000 words a day.
Wow.
But it's always at the backside, the downhill slope of the novel, right? I couldn't be that productive.
For those of you tuning in, 1,000 words is 4 pages.
Yeah, and I normally write 2,000 a day. That's just my normal
rhythm
rate. But when I go up there, it's like 3 times that. But like I said, it happens at the end of the book. It's when I've already, it's the home stretch, right? You see the finish line, and I've always found that's the easiest section to write. And I don't know about you, but I always had the endings of my book in mind. Even when I write chapter 1, I generally know how the scene that is going to depict the end of the book is always in my head.
When I was working on the end of The Paris Wife, and I had young kids, and I was working in a Starbucks, writing in a Starbucks because I had no privacy, I did write one day 10,000 words, but I was like in a fugue state. I had never been.
And I would not recommend that on a daily basis.
No. It sort of takes years of your life, I think.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's why I always mostly I cut myself off at 2000 because I do feel in your normal space and your normal day and your normal life, more than that is just asking too much of you in so many ways.
Yeah. So let's talk about your characters a little. These two sisters that you follow, and they're not the only major characters in the novel, but they really struck me as reminiscent, these two girls, Raina and Gerda, as almost something out of a Laura Ingalls Wilder story, or something out of my, Willa Cather. My Antonia is one of my favorite novels.
I reread all of Willa Cather before I wrote this.
Yes.
That is inspiration.
So there's something about the fortitude of the immigrants, what the land requires if you're going to survive it. There's just like a will, like the ferocity of will. But then I was also struck by these, the same way that Mary kind of goes off in the Little House books, goes off to teach at 16, for instance, and she's a child, like having to.
But that's Laura, actually. Mary was
Laura.
Yeah, but Laura does.
I think it's Mary in
maybe in the TV show.
In the TV, right. I'm getting it.
Goes off to the blind school.
But essentially, they're children, these young women, and in your novel, that really comes to bear because they're forced to make decisions that no children, no young women, nobody actually, no adults even should have to make. Others' lives are at stake.
When I was doing the research for this, I knew, yes, I loved the Little House on the Prairie books when I was growing up. Absolutely. I think if you're a woman of a certain generation or two, those books, along with, you might say, Betsy Tacy and Tib books and Little Women for sure, those are the books you read as children. And I loved them and I adored them, and I have a whole collection of them, and I reread them as an adult. As an adult, I'm very aware of the problems in those novels. The Ingalls are Charles, Pa, and Ma. They're native-born Americans, and their story is not the immigrant story. And in fact, if you reread the novels, it's interesting to see how they depict immigrants. And they're usually not as wealthy, and not that the Ingalls were ever wealthy, but they are usually depicted in a very slightly kind of off way. And in their version of the Prairie, there are no Black people, which was false. And I did try to include that in my novel. Right. And the treatment and the depiction of Native Americans is just really wrong in those novels. And they were written in 1930, and they were written for children. And there's such, they're lovely books. I have wonderful memories of reading those books, but they're not the book. I kind of write the adult realization of Little House on the Prairie in these. But you pointed out, there are some episodes in those books that always stood out to me as a little darker than other episodes. One of them is in the book These Happy Golden Years, when Laura does go off to teach for the first time, and she's boarding at a stranger's house, and she witnesses a kind of a dark episode, and that a family that is not as happy on the Prairie as her family is. And an odd little episode in these very kind of golden rosy hued books, and that always struck me. And so as I was researching this and realizing that the Prairie school teachers were these 16-year-old girls, that the Prairie townships, they were very poor compared to places like Omaha. So and they were homesteaders, and so many of them were immigrants to this land, so that they could not afford to pay, say, like a town like Omaha could, to have an college educated teacher teach their children. They didn't have the money. So that meant that they relied on their native daughters. They could get a certificate, as I think Laura Ingalls does in those books, by taking an examination, and they then could teach K through what would probably be like 7th or 8th grade. Right. And for most of these young girls, this was the first thing they did after being in the classroom themselves, and most of them had to go live with strangers while doing it. And then especially in the case of these immigrants, as embodied by Gerda and Reina in my novel, they're not speaking their first language. English was the second language because these were children of immigrants, or maybe they'd been born here, as infants. But they're forced to speak English in the classroom because that was the requirement. So they're teaching their second language to children for whom English is not their native language either. Right. They're teaching children ranging in age from like 6 to 15. And if they're young girls, many of these older male pupils, probably physically bigger than they are, and they're living with strangers. They're maybe experiencing a living situation that is not at all like the one they're used to. And then all of a sudden you throw in a blizzard, right? That was such an amazing thing for me to really kind of grasp. I knew all the basics. I knew that they were young girls, because of the Little House on the Prairie books, but to fully grasp the situation these young women were in, and they became heroines, many of them, in the aftermath of this storm, right. But some of them didn't. And that's what I wanted to explore with the characters of the two sisters.
Right. Well, they're faced with impossible decisions. I was very, and also to me, it reveals that sometimes life asks too much of us. Right.
I think I've said that in some other things about the book, that the Prairie asked too much of the daughters in this way. But you know what? Another thing I really wanted to explore, and this is a little personal because of my family, farmers, it asked too much of the sons as well, because the decision made by these immigrant heads of households to pick up everything and leave the old world behind and come to this hostile new land meant they were tethering their children to that land for generations and generations and not giving them choices. And it's very interesting to think that those who were children during the the children's blizzard, grew up to be the grandparents during the Dust Bowl. And both, so that was their life. And all because of the decisions that their parents had made.
That was a point that really surprised me that you make kind of late in the book, is that ironically, the young women had a little more choice, because at least they could go and teach, they could go board with another family, even if it was strangers, even if there was tension, even if life was difficult, they could experience something like adventure or some newness, and that the young men didn't really have a choice to go to college, for instance, or to educate themselves, to go to the city and to do anything.
They had to work the land. They had to work the farm.
land. And so it's like being handcuffed to this incredibly difficult life.
Right. And you mentioned Willa Cather, who I adore, and her writing is so lyrical. She does write, though, a very idealistic version, I think, sometimes of what the world was, what the experience was.
Do you think so?
Sometimes she's lyrical about it. She's very.
Oh, her language is so
right, but
beautiful.
She's coming to this from the love. This is her land. This is her love. I know that in my Antonia, when we first meet Antonia's family, they're living in squalor, and
in
the character of Annette
is starving to death.
But and the character of Annette in my novel reflects that reality as well.
Right, the bohemian experience, and that really was when I said that I was reminded of Willa Cather. It was Annette's experience that reminded me of that. Yeah, I think what in my Antonia, the thing that really stands out for me is the friendship between, and I'm blanking on his name. I think it's
his name. Jim. I can't remember. Jim.
Jim. Jim. Well, let's say Jim.
Okay.
Well, I think so, though.
I think it is.
And Antonia and the romanticization of their friendship, but his romanticization of her as this, that she is this earth mother, that she is the land, that she can survive anything, and that she's magnificent.
But do you think she thought of it that way?
Yes. I mean, I imagine not, but I don't think that Cather is painting the prairie in an idealistic way, except as a young thing, right? As a young thing that breaks people and that is broken. There's that image, do you remember, of the plow against the setting sun? It's this beautiful, as the land is being.
But I think I keep going back, though, it's told from the point of view of the young American boy,
Right.
not from
True.
the immigrant. And
True.
even there, we're looking at a different kind of class distinction between the two of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we know the other side of the story.
Yeah. And also in Song of the Lark, she's pretty harsh about small town on the prairie life.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole point of that novel is for the heroine, and everyone wants her to go away, get out of here. This is not for you.
Right.
I don't know how, I mean, we could talk about Willa Cather all night. It's
a little bit of a tangent. So
yeah,
back to your characters. So whose story were you most moved by, or was there anything that came along and surprised you as you were excavating this book, or following these characters?
Absolutely. The characters of Raina and Annette in particular, and somewhat of Gerda, are a little bit based. Some of their characters, their story and their arc and their journey, I did base on some real actual survivors and victims of the storm, whose stories we know. So those three, and I think they're probably, you would call them the three main characters of the novel, their stories and their arcs, and how I knew their lives would be impacted by the storm and what trajectory they would take. I pretty much knew that. I had that plotted out in my head. So I loved their characters, but they didn't surprise me so much. Although I delighted, I loved telling their stories, particularly Annette's, from a child's point of view. So there were some other characters. Gavin Woodson represents, and he's completely fabricated, not based on anyone in real life, but he is one of those. He's a failed newspaperman who has been kind of relegated to godforsaken Omaha, as he calls it, to write these fake news, false news stories to lure these immigrants over. And so as such, he is kind of filled with self-loathing and also a bit of loathing for the rubes, as he calls it, who believed him. And he surprised me even at the very beginning in the writing of him. The very first chapter he's in, I intended him to go one direction, and he decided to go another direction. And a chance encounter completely changed his purpose in the novel. And then his story becomes really the story of the second half. His journey, his quest, I guess you could say, kind of became what the second half of the book was about. Didn't think I'd planned it that way, so I was really delighted. Ollie Tennant, who is a Black bartender in Omaha, he surprised me quite a bit in the scene, particularly when he has to go find his children in Omaha, because the white community is not thinking of the Black community, and he realizes he has to do this. And the whole scene in that his children's classroom is a pretty tense one, and his story surprised me. And then most importantly for me was Anna Peterson,
right,
who I intended, the way she is first presented in the novel in a not a very flattering light, was how I kind of intended her to stay, but no, she showed me otherwise. And while her journey is rather dark and twisted, it is in its own way a redemptive journey. And I've never written a character like her before, and I really enjoyed it. And she surprised me a lot. Yeah.
And the way her story connects with Annette's story. And
right.
But there also is, even her story. So she starts off as this very cold, exacting, Annette and Raina both board with her in the Peterson homestead, and she's incredibly difficult woman to have lord over the household. But even her story, I feel, maybe you didn't mean to, but I felt some sympathy for her, because of course she didn't ask for any of this.
Right. No, I definitely intended you to. Well, I'm not interested in one-dimensional characters, even when they're supposedly villains, right? I thought of Anna as, so we'll go back to the Little House on the Prairie books. I always felt so sorry for Ma in those books that I thought Charles was rather kind of demented in his continuing me uprooting this family from from society and friends.
Probably
and
making many readers angry now.
I know, if you go back and read them, and you just realize what was he seeking? He could never and Ma was helpless. She had to be uprooted time and again and make a new home every time and make new friends every time. And so Anna is one of those women, and it's a darker version of Ma Ingalls, I guess you could say, because I do think the Prairie made women mad in some ways, the harshness of the circumstances. And in Anna's case, she didn't want to leave St. Paul, where she lived with her family and her sisters and the Norwegian community there. And all of a sudden her husband takes it in his mind that he must own land because he is an American man now. And he takes her out in the middle of nowhere. And what does that do? Not every woman has the serenity of a Caroline Ingalls. I think Anna represents the woman who this whole being so dependent on a man who has uprooted her and taken her out to a very horrible place to try to live alone without the comfort of her family and her friends. It does something very dark too.
No, definitely. And she doesn't have the tools we see right away to live in this place that is so demanding.
Yeah, but yet the blizzard does it as it did to everyone. Even if she wasn't out in the elements herself, it completely changed her life and her perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we only have a few minutes left. Can you just say briefly before we go to Q&A? I'm so curious about what's next for you now.
Well, as you know, sometimes you can't quite say what's next. I know what it is. I took a year off from writing. It was always intentional to do it. I've published 7 novels now in 11 years and wrote 2 that I decided personally not to publish. And I just was ready for a bit of a break and a breather, and I needed to recalibrate. And I love this book. It took every emotion out of me, but I loved it. I loved feeling I loved writing that way, and wholeheartedly, everything. And I had intended to take a year off, and then the pandemic hit. So it's a good thing I didn't take a year off from writing, because I probably couldn't have written during this year anyway. So I also wanted to take my time to find out what I wanted to write next, to see, was the children's blizzard, does that represent the direction I want to go now? And I think it does. And so I have found that subject. It's similar in scope, but it will not be the same book, but it's similar in scope and direction as the children's blizzard. And once I've started it now, I gave waited till the new year to start writing, and because I said I was not going to write during 2020. And so now, once all this is over, I'm ready to get back into it. I do know what I'm writing next, but unfortunately I can't share. But you have this When the Stars Go Dark. Can you, before we get to Q&A, can you give us like a couple of
just super quick? It is literary suspense set in the 1990s in Northern California, and it's about sort of a tortured missing persons detective who becomes obsessed with an abducted teen in a village that she cares very much about, and which reminds her of a crime that went unsolved when she was a girl also in this town. And so it goes back and forth through time, and also involves some real life characters, real life missing persons, including Polyclaus, who disappeared.
That sounds, I haven't read it yet. I've got it. Susanna sent it to me. I will read it as soon as this is all over. I can't wait. I know it's brilliant.
It was a story that really surprised me, that came from nowhere, and that absolutely challenged me. And it's out April 13th. So thanks so much, Melanie. And now John from Literati, thanks for hosting us tonight. And we'll move on to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for a really wonderful conversation. Our first question was plans for the next book. So Paula, you have this novel coming out on April 13th, but it's for both authors. So do you have plans for what you're going to be writing after you go through your virtual tour and all that comes with it for the new novel?
I think I'm writing a series, which has never occurred to me to write, but I love this world. I love these characters. They're cemented in my
You mean
mind.
a series this is the first in a
Series with the
series.
same detective. Her
Yeah.
name's Anna Hart, and sort of following her. I feel like she has more work to do. That's how I'm thinking of it. So we'll see, fingers crossed. That's the direction it seems to be going. Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah,
We have a few questions that are a variation on a theme, but I'll read the one from someone I think you both know. Sarah McCoy writes,
Sarah. Hi, Sarah. We were just talking about you.
Yay!
can you describe each of your research processes? Are you plotters or pantsers with your narrative creations? And someone else asks, at what point do you start research for your project? Does it happen as you write, or do you start far in advance?
Well, everything's different, but I do the research up front, and I am learning now to do more research before I decide to write a subject. I think a couple times in the past I may have decided I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to write this novel without doing quite enough research to make sure I had enough story to tell. And so I do a significant amount of research even before I decide to write the novel. And then once I've decided on it, then I do more. I don't do as much research as people probably think I do, because I am often starting everything I've written about. I've had a basic armchair historian's base level knowledge of the history, even the Great Plains. I read tons of history and biographies, so I've got lots of homesteading years, histories on my bookshelves that I've read years ago. So I kind of started from a pretty comfortable place there. And I am not a pantser. When I talk about my characters taking me in unexpected arcs, that's delightful, but I don't have a chapter by chapter outline. I don't do that. It's a very general outline, and most of it's in my head of the story I want to tell. If it's about a real person's life, I know I'm not telling their entire life. I know it's just a portion of their life that I'm going to really concentrate on in this novel. And I have to have that pretty well thought out, and the characters, sketched out, and sort of know where some of them are going, but yet keep the door open for them to surprise me. But yeah, I'm not a pantser. I'm more of a plotter.
I always admire people who are so organized and they have things mapped out and their index cards and their
not that organized. It's
and
mostly
sometimes, I heard that Amor Towles sort of like plotted his book out in his head for years before he ever wrote a word.
I do that, not for years, but for months. I do carry it around in my head for a long time.
Yeah, well, I'm the opposite. I'm irrational and intuitive, and whatever happens, that mysterious magical thing that happens where you're struck by an idea from outer space, from that moment on, I usually start writing. Sometimes that day, wanting to sort of want that magic carpet to take me someplace. And then I read like mad, like trying to catch up to myself and to know what I need to know in order to keep up with the writing. I'm always very struck by a voice, and then try to follow that voice into a world, and then to build the world, then the furniture of that world, then I go looking for everything that I need to know. But I love hearing about other people's processes. Absolutely.
We're all different.
It's fun when we get to play together like this. So yeah. Thanks for that question, Sarah. Sarah McCoy, the lovely writer who is a friend of both of ours. So yeah, that was nice to hear her.
Thank you, Sarah. Oh,
I'm
sorry.
Can't
hear you.
I had muted myself. Someone writes in, Melanie, when did you first realize you wanted to be a writer?
So I wasn't, maybe Paula is, I was not someone who knew she wanted to be a writer when she was a child. My first ambition was the stage, the theater. I wanted to be the theater. And I was a very odd, creative child that nobody quite knew what to do with in my family. So I had no support for any creative life. And I wanted to go to New York and go to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts when I graduated from high school. And there was no support for that. I was like, no, we will not give you the money to do that. You're on your own. And I did not have the guts to do it on my own. So I went to college and I hated it and I dropped out and I did a lot of theater. And it wasn't until I was almost 40 when I had stopped doing theater and just was the stay-at-home mom, PTA president, that a friend of mine said, I always thought you'd be a writer. And when she said that, a lot of things in my life made sense. And I had always been a huge reader. Okay. I never studied writing ever in college or anywhere, but I think if you have the talent, if you read all the time, you've learned a lot about novel structure and things. So I was always a huge reader. So I sat down before I was 40 and had enough success to keep me going. And then my first novel was published in 2005, I guess it was. So I was like 43. But it was a huge epic failure and I had to start all over again. And then I published Alice I Have Been in 2010.
Love that book. I love that.
Thank you. And that was how I became a historical novelist. And then I was in my 50s the first time I hit the New York Times bestseller list. So I think my journey's different than a lot of authors I know.
I think there is a connection though, don't you, between theater and
yes,
and literature. I mean, particularly in this vein, the historical, when you find these characters and they speak to you through you and all
and you have to get inside their skin. You have to be able to make them come to life.
Inside them and look out their eyes and see the world. It's very
And I know a lot of writers who have some kind of theatrical or performing background.
Right.
So it's very interesting to see how those worlds kind of connect.
Someone writes in asking.
But Paula, how did you be?
Oh, no, John, please.
There's just a question. There's a question. There's just a little spur on this, which is just someone wants to know what your favorite theater role was, and if you'd write a novel about it.
Oh gosh, no. My favorite theater. I was Carla in 9, and when I was at my absolute peak of sexiness in my life, and then it all went downhill from there. But I wore a nude body stocking with black fishnet, and I was hot. So that might have been, and I did a number called The Call to the Vatican, where I did a back bend in heels this tall on the stage and back up while singing.
We should have started with that, Melanie.
It was. That was
you buried the lead.
That was the peak. Yeah, I should have thought of that. I did the splits too.
but I did interject. So Melanie, please ask Paula what you wanted to ask her.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if she'd always thought she wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
No, I always wrote, but I didn't know one could be a writer.
I never thought of it as anything that I could make a living.
You just
it's
read,
just so natural.
I mean, I suppose so. I mean, I came to it very late in the game and I started as a poet, but there was a time when I didn't think, like the thing that I thought I was going to be was a secretary with a Honda Civic. Like that was shooting for the stars. You know what I mean? And
I know.
And then your life comes along and surprises you. So
I'm a late bloomer, and I used to tell my kids, I have 2 sons, they're 31 and 29. And back in the day when in middle school, they were being pressured to declare a major in college. You know how the pressure is for kids. Right. I used to say, guys, I am the poster child for the person who has no idea what she wants to do. I am the poster child for second acts. You don't need to know what you need to do right now.
Absolutely.
Question for both of you. Both of you have written historical fiction about real people. Of the people you have written about, who do you wish you could have met and spent time interviewing?
Truman Capote, hands down.
Wasn't he fascinating?
Fascinating. It terrified me how easy it was for me to become him on the page. But absolutely Truman Capote.
I guess for me, and I get asked all the time because I've written now 2 novels featuring Ernest Hemingway, not really about him, but he's the boorish husband. If he would be the person, and I think not. Also, I'm often asked, am I in love with him? Which of course I sort of am. I mean, would I have married him? No. Would I have had an affair with him? For sure, I think, and then regretted it. But the novel that followed The Paris Wife, which is called Circling the Sun, is about a historical aviator, horse trainer, badass, who grows up in colonial Kenya and is involved with all the out of Africa characters. Her name is Beryl Markham. And she's,
I love that book. Love
thank
that
you.
book.
Circling the Sun. Anyway, she's the character that I would want to just hang out with, like in a Thelma and Louise movie, and make bad decisions with, you know, for a little bit.
I think we have time for one more question. It's from Melanie. Melanie, I saw on Instagram that you said that you think The Children's Blizzard is your best book. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I do think it is. And I don't say that with every book. Because of, because I put everything in it. Okay. I put every emotion there. It does cover every emotion. You will have all the feels in this book. I put my heart, my soul, everything into this book. And I think I told a bigger story, I think, than I've told before. And I just very proud of it. I just have felt proud of it from the beginning. And it's not something I can put into words so much. It's just a feeling that I feel that this one has more of me, maybe, than some of my other books.
Well, thank you, and congratulations on the publication and all the
Thank
success of
you.
the book. And thank you, Melanie Benjamin, and thank you, Paula McLain, for joining us
Thank
this
you,
evening.
Paula.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Melanie.
Thank
May you
you.
have huge success with this book.
Oh, and
I
I'm
also
going to do
think
this for me one more time.
your-
Children's Blizzard. Children's Blizzard. Yay.
And you can purchase Children's Blizzard. There's a link in the chat. There's a link in the description and YouTube as well. And you can order When the Stars Go Dark, which comes out April 13th
Thank
at
you,
Literati
John.
Bookstore.
Thank you, Literati.
Thank you, Literati. Thank you all for
Take care.
attending. Thanks so much.
Thanks all. Take care and have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.